You, my guardian angel, take my soul of fire. In this game, we're double agents.
You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the deeper messages, symbols, and predictive programming subtext that underlie modern film. In this show, we will be interviewing artists, experts, and numerous people in media fields. And this will all be based on my years of research in comparative religion, propaganda, psychological warfare, secret societies, and espionage. Esoteric Hollywood decodes the biggest movies in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with completely new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. How y'all doing out there? Tonight, something lighthearted on Esoteric Hollywood. We're going to investigate the philosophical meaning of a couple films. The first, of course, being Groundhog Day, the 1993 Harold Ramis film with Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell from Columbia Pictures. Now, why would something seemingly rather silly be the subject of Esoteric Hollywood? Well, I remember reading a few years ago some interesting online analyses that talked about the fact that Groundhog Day actually has quite a bit of symbolism in it. And so I went back and reviewed the film. I hadn't seen it in many years. And I recalled that even in my undergrad classes in philosophy, we dealt with this film at one point. So it's certainly something worth considering. It's not lacking in deeper meaning and significance, and depending on time constraints, if we get through this one pretty quick, I will try to discuss the Truman Show as well. And I see an interesting link between these two films. Not anything particularly directly connected between them, but philosophically speaking, there's similarities between these two. Now, Bill Murray plays Phil Connors, right, who is a weatherman, and he's this sort of snotty, pretentious, self-important, city slicker. And for Phil Connors, there's nothing but disdain for his job that he's got to cover the Punxsutawney Phil ceremony out in Pennsylvania. And so for him, it's all about, climbing the ladder and moving up the weatherman totem pole and making it to the national network to do the weather. And until he gets to that point, his life for him is, merely a corporate scam. And, getting to the top is all that matters. And it's ego, right? He's got a huge ego. And what we see is that he's contrasted, obviously, with the small town people, whom he, deridingly refers to as the small town, the Hicks, right? And so when he gets there, there's some pretty good comic scenes between Bill Murray, who's, obviously a classic comedian, probably one of the best film comics that we've seen. And we'll notice that the film is going to deal with nature quite a bit. Weather, right? Weather is obviously a big part of it, because the weather is something that is common to everyone, right? It's something mundane and yet at the same time very profound. We're all also partly beings of nature, right? We're beings that partly exist within a biosphere. And there's going to be, as we see, a connection between Phil, Punxsutawney Phil, this goofy groundhog, and the character of Truman himself, where we're going to see this alienation that's recurred. I think we're supposed to partly gain from this, that because of his city living so-called sophistication and his ego-driven careerism, the alienation and misery that Phil Connors experiences is something that is a result of what he's imbibed in his I guess we could say civilized city living. And this is something that civilization, so-called, does have a tendency to do to people. It has this alienating aspect, as Emil Durkheim wrote about in his pieces on sociology, and I think that's correct, right? The urbanization and so forth. Now, predicting the weather, right, forecasting the future is something that Phil Connors does. He talks about tomorrow. And this is going to be referenced many times in the film, where you have the discussion of what if there's no tomorrow. And this is why there's going to be a connection between Phil and Phil the Groundhog. Now, Phil the Groundhog is said, of course, if he sees his shadow, there will be 6 more weeks of winter. And Phil seeing his shadow is going to be an interesting symbol or parallel for Phil, right? Phil Connors living in his shadow, or seeing his shadow. The shadow will, of course, be his own ego, his own mirror, dark side, shade self, his past, and so forth, that is keeping him stuck in a loop, so to speak. And so when we think about nature and we think about determination, the determination of nature, it recalls to mind ancient philosophy, particularly amongst the Greeks and the Romans, which is the notion of destiny or fate, right? And the idea here being that the elements, that is, the elements of nature, right, and the domination of time and nature determine us, and that determination is something concocted or crafted, so to speak, by the gods or the fates. And there's nothing that you could do to escape your fate, right? You were destined to it. And so this will be what was one of the important philosophical questions of the film, is, of course, fate and predestination, or determination, right? Predetermination. And the question of free will. Does Phil Connors have free will? Can he change his destiny? Is he programmed to be what he is? Can he break free from that? These are all questions that are going to be raised by Groundhog Day. Now, of course, free will and predestination have a long history of debate in the West in philosophy and in religion and theology, with, of course, different schools like Augustinianism or Calvinism stressing the sovereignty and predetermination of God in terms of foreordaining and choosing all events ahead of time, and then other schools of theology that will stress the freedom of man to actually make and choose between 2 real options, right? That he's not a determined force of nature, but actually has volition and is a person. He's free. Now, this is going to be a huge debate that will be a huge debate in this film, as even Bill Murray will later ask himself these kinds of questions. Now, that's fascinating, because prior to Phil Connors' experiences, he's never thought this way. He's never asked these questions. Nothing like that's ever mattered to him. But when he begins to have this strange, otherworldly, almost divine experience, something outside of his normal experience, he's going to begin to have a traumatic break and then question the nature of reality itself and his own phenomena, his own experience. And we're told as well that he's looking for everybody in the town, of course, as well as looking for the, quote, first day of spring. Now, in the history of literature, we have winter is, of course, always signifying death, right? It's the season when everything's frozen, life goes away in terms of, the trees and the plants, animals go and hibernate, leaves fall off and are dead and frozen. It's the time of death. Spring is, of course, the time of rebirth, sexual vitality, and life, right? New birth. And the seasons are going to play an important role in the film because, as we said, there's a connection between weather and weather forecasting and nature and man, right? And is man determined as an aspect of nature, or does he have free will? Now, as another curious parallel as well is the fact that this sort of arrogant, Scroogey character is similar to a role that Bill Murray played in Scrooged. If you remember that other 90s comedy where he's kind of a Scrooge, and ultimately Groundhog Day is kind of a Charles Dickens Scrooge type story, where it's not until there's a change within his inner character that results from these traumatic breaks that he experiences that Phil Connors will begin to move outside of himself, so to speak. Right? Prior to this, he's an egomaniac who worships himself. And he's even called out on this by Andie MacDowell's character. But nothing will suffice until he actually begins to... In other words, it requires a psychotic break for him to snap back into reality, to be set straight, so to speak. There are some interesting Freudian and, I guess, psychoanalytic aspects of this film that are subtle references. For one is Gobbler's Knob, which I guess I take that to be a sexual innuendo. I don't know, but it sounds completely ridiculous. Gobbler's Knob. We learn that Phil Connors is somewhat sexually repressed. He fantasizes when he's drinking about the great sex he had one time when he was on vacation, and we get the impression that things haven't been so great in a long time for him because he's so focused on his career. The only thing that matters to him is getting ahead in the totem pole of weathermen, right, and getting to the top of that funny sector of society. So there's no time for love or relationships, and this is, of course, why he dismisses Andie MacDowell, who even at the beginning is somewhat shows a mild degree of interest in him, inviting him to dinner and so forth, which of course he turns down. Phil, the Groundhog, is spoken of as the seer of seers, and this is funny because it's sort of making light of even the idea of the weatherman himself. I mean, the weatherman's not really that much of a prognosticator or forecaster, right? So he's, again, like Phil, the Groundhog. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. This is Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com, and we're deconstructing, having a little bit of fun with Groundhog Day. Welcome back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. We're talking about Groundhog Day, the 1993 Harold Ramis film from Columbia Pictures. And you might be a little surprised to be hearing Groundhog Day being deconstructed on jaysanalysis.com. But as I said, there are quite a few interesting philosophical questions raised in the film, as well as ethical questions. Of course, if you take philosophy, you will take courses on ethics and the history of ethics insofar as they are a branch of philosophy. And all of these questions will be raised in the film Groundhog Day. And as we were discussing in the previous segment, we saw that Punxsutawney Phil is, again, connected to the character of Phil. They're both named Phil. They both foreshadow the weather. One of them is an animal. An animal in existentialist philosophy, for example, has no being for itself. It's a determined entity that is, according to Jean-Paul Sartre, being in itself. And by that he means that there's not any real free choice. He's stuck in the roles that society has laid out for him. All right. Now, I'm speaking there of Phil the Weatherman, right, who's stuck in the role that society's laid out for him, in the same way that the groundhog can only be a groundhog. He can never be other than a groundhog, because it's the instinctual nature of the groundhog to be and do what a groundhog does. It's also the instinctual nature of the determined, inauthentic man, who is again symbolized by Phil Connors, to only be and do what he is able to do according to the roles that he's chosen. However, in Sartre's existentialism, Sartre says that this is actually bad faith, because humans are completely free and in fact condemned to be free. And the status of being condemned to be free means that you don't have a choice in that matter. You have to be free. And if you don't choose to be free, you will go mad, and you will choose you'll play these sort of plastic cookie cutter set before you roles, and not live up to your potential and so forth. Now, Sartre, of course, takes that much further, and even in the case of other existentialists like Kosmou, we see the discussion of how suicide is even logical there, and Sartre says much the same thing in some of his essays and fictional stories, such as The Wall. But so the question then is, are you going to be determined, just as nature and the groundhog are determined to be what they are, or are you going to step out of these determined roles and be free? And for the first, I'd say, half of the film, the first two acts, Bill Murray's character, Phil Connors, is completely determined. He's inauthentic, and he's in bad faith, right? He's not what he truly is. He's operating under a bunch of masks and living a lie. And that, of course, is the source of his unhappiness, which Phil Connors, of course, projects onto everyone and everything else. Oh, it's the town, it's the weather, it's his co-workers, everything else. It's his past, but not himself. That is the problem, or the issue that needs to be changed and fixed. So Phil, of course, comes out at the ceremony, and he said, and the groundhog, I see a shadow, 6 more weeks of winter, death, right? So it's almost like we get the impression that it's 6 more weeks, maybe, of what Bill Murray's doing when he's stuck in this loop. Although we don't know for sure, because it could possibly also be a lot longer. It's even spoken of kind of figuratively as eternity, given the fact that he has the time to go out and basically memorize everything going on in the town, as well as learn to play classical piano, learn other languages, and so forth. So every one of these days for him seems to stretch on into eternity. And we're supposed to make, I think, the connection that he's in a state of death. But even though he's not literally physically dead, it's death, figuratively speaking, of which he is in that perpetual state. He's dead. He's like when Sartre describes inauthenticity and bad faith and being in itself, he describes it like a rock, right? Nature, an aspect of nature. And then for the human is different, because the human is supposed to be and condemned to be authentic, free, and being for itself. Self-determining. So when Bill is trapped, he immediately, of course, freaks out. He's ready to get out of Hicksville, and he drives as fast as he can once the blizzard arrives, to the edge of town, and he finds out that he's stuck there. And the cop tells him that the blizzard's blown in and all the roads are shut down, and you're pretty much stuck here, nothing else you can do. Bill Murray kind of has a meltdown and says, I make the weather, right? It's me. in other words, he's got this completely deluded, almost God complex about himself, we discover. And it's a process of having all of this refined out of him, if you will, or ground out of him, that's going to have to occur before Phil can have a change of heart. And even though he, sees his role as, he sees himself actually as a celebrity, right? He says, I'm a celebrity. I need to get out of this town. Can somebody get me a celebrity emergency ride out of here? Right. And all he is a local weatherman. He's not a real celebrity. Right. But, he sees himself in this completely erroneous image that's sort of this construct, right? It's a ego construct that he has of himself, that he's basically God in his own mind. And as we said, that's all going to have to be completely wiped away. And it is in fact not he that makes the weather. Now, as he returns to the town and the successive days of eternal recurrence begin to happen, it turns out that he senses that something more is going on, right? And we have this notion of the enclosed environment, right? This sort of the completely controlled environment, which is a fascinating presentation that we've seen in quite a few shows and films, something like The Matrix, or something like The Truman Show, as we'll see later, or perhaps something like the TV show The Prisoner, that if you are interested in that, you can see my extensive analyses of both The Matrix and The Prisoner at jasonanalysis.com, as well as in my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which you can get from amazon.com. So, in this enclosed environment, what we have is something kind of akin to Plato's cave, which in the Republic, it's book 7, where Plato presents the allegory of the cave. And this is ultimately intended to convey and explain the Platonic view of how we learn things and know things, and what reality and truth really are. So in this perspective, the idea is that the world that we experience out there is not the true world. We can go touch, sense, smell, knock on wood, and feel, we can have a 5-sense experience of the things that are out there. But we learn that those things are fleeting, right? They're changing. As we saw, the seasons come and go, trees live and die, humans live and die, things change over time. And it's change that gives birth to the notion of decay, of flux, of thermodynamics even, right? Entropy. All of these things are elements of what in philosophy is called becoming. And becoming is often set against being, right? Being is changeless, timeless, eternal, and for Plato, not in our realm primarily. So even though things have a kind of existence out there in the world, they're more like shadows. They're more like copies or phantasms that come and go. And it's only through perceiving the true things behind the things that we see, the archetypes or the forms of things, that we come to understand that our world is merely almost like a dream state. It's almost a fictional facade, something like a movie set, right? Which will be directly relevant to the Truman Show, as we'll see. But for Plato and for Platonism, you can see how this would then also tie in to Groundhog Day, because Bill Murray will start to realize that he feels like he's trapped in this small enclosed cave-like environment of this small town, and everything seems to take on this characteristic of, how can we put it, meaninglessness, right? So he begins to have this existential break, right, a crisis, as things start to repeat. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. We're discussing the meaningless, mundane morass of movements from day to day that are plaguing the character Phil Connor as he begins to discover he's caught in a kind of loop where everything is the same, it's over and over and over, and he's stuck. Like we said, an enclosed environment, much like Plato's cave, and will be very similar to the situation that we'll see in our next film, The Truman Show. Now, the days begin to repeat, and as we said, it's getting more and more anguishing as he discovers, with a reasonable and understandable bit of paranoia at first, that everything is not as planned, and everything is not as he expected here in this town, and in fact he's stuck. And every day is repeating with the exact same Sonny and Cher song coming on at 6 o'clock in the morning with the alarm. I got you, babe. And Phil Connors makes the interesting statement, what if there is no tomorrow? Right? So it's like this glitch in the matrix keeps happening, and Phil begins to speculate, and he says, maybe there's just no such thing as the idea of tomorrow, right? And if there's no tomorrow, then essentially the job of the weatherman is meaningless, right? And so his very reason for everything that he has sought to do, which was to climb the corporate weatherman ladder, now it no longer has any meaning. And as he previously worshipped his job, right, as the end-all be-all of existence, now with nothing else to do, he begins to take on this sort of fear of nihilism, right? And this is the fear that Sartre talked about in existentialism, of the fear of death and the fear of nothingness, the fear of non-being, the fear of, for Sartre at least, no God. And what do we do in those cases? Well, Sartre says that we have an emotional attachment to things that help to placate our fears. The opiate of the masses, as Marx would talk about, religion, or we have these social constructs that we think give us meaning according to that philosophy. Now, I don't think that that's true, but I think that that's that philosophy. And so Phil, he goes to this series of events where he's desperately trying to figure out what's happening to him. He tries to fix the situation. He even goes to a psychiatrist if he thinks he's going crazy. And when he goes, he describes what he's experiencing, and the doctors can't find anything wrong with him. There's an interesting book sitting on the desk of the psychiatrist's office as he talks to Phil, and it's the book called The Body Has a Head by Gustav Eckstein, which was a popular book in the 60s, kind of in the train of Freudian and Pavlovian conditioning and psychoanalysis. And so the book talks about the fact that we have a body with all these functions, but it's ruled by the head, and that ultimately it's kind of the psyche and psychiatry that determines the rest of human physiognomy and physiology. And so by understanding the mind and the psyche, Eichmann thought, you could then get a better grasp on the rest of the body. And borrowing, as we said, from the Freudian elements, we see that, as I said, Gobbler's knob, and the idea of he's not in a consistent sexual relationship, he's repressed, and this is part of the reason for his self-obsession and self-focus, his egotism. And according to Pavlov, of course, we have the ideas of operant conditioning and training through the ringing of the bell and the salivating of the dog and so forth. And that's what we're supposed to glean from these scenes about Phil Connors, is that he's much like Pavlov and Freud described, right? He's subject to all these problems and psychoses, and the only way that he's going to get out of these is to figure out that the problem for him is not all of these external stimuli and all of these things out there in the world. It's not everything that he's projecting his problems onto. that are the source of what's wrong with him, but it's his own self, his own ego, his own mirror reflection, and miscalculated and exaggerated view of himself. Now, Bill Murray then begins to drink and goes out and parties with the idiot rednecks in the town, and just kind of gets into a state of doesn't give a fuck, right? And he says, basically, I haven't had sex since, well, he says that he had this great fantasy this vacation where he was with this chick who was kind of this fantasy chick he met, and she was gorgeous, and they had shrimp, and they had a great night. And he says, why can't my eternal day that I have to live out be that day, right? And he says to his bar buddies, you ever find yourself stuck in a place and every day is the same and nothing you did mattered, right? And so what we have here is nihilism, and nihilism is the philosophical position of nothingism. Nothing matters, nothing is true, there's no real reason for doing one thing over another. It ultimately doesn't matter, right? Everything is just chaos anyway. We're all going to return to the void of chaos. The universe will burn up, explode, wind down into nothing, right? Supposedly, according to the so-called scientists. And so nothing matters, right? This doesn't require hedonism per se, because there's no reason to be hedonistic over not being hedonistic. You say, oh, well, it gives you pleasure. Right, but there's no reason to choose pleasure over pain. What is just what is, and that's it. And ultimately, the attitude that Bill Murray's character, Phil Connors, begins to take on here is appropriate for the world in which we are just merely determined nature. If we're just determined nature and nothing matters, then there really is no reason to choose virtue over vice or vice over virtue. There's no reason for anything or to do anything. So anything goes and nothing goes, right? That's the ultimate end result of nihilism. And that's ultimately that is the position that he begins to find himself in as he's undergoing this kind of process of self-realization and alchemical change, I think we could say. Now, there's another interesting feature of Platonism that's worth mentioning too, that is the question of forgetting. In Platonic philosophy, we existed prior to our existence in this realm in a higher realm or state of being. And there we were closer to or connected to the one, God, the monad, the forms. And by some sort of schism or fall, we found ourselves placed into this life and born of a natural mother. And we have in fact forgotten what our origin is. Our origin and our true nature is, for Plato, much higher, much grander, much more grandiose, but is completely forgotten. And it's described in Platonism as similar to the notion of waking up and forgetting your dream or forgetting what happened the day before. And so you can see a close analogy between sleep, dreaming, and forgetting, right, and the awake state, right, which Bill Murray is, of course, undergoing this process of awakening about himself and about the world and about meaning. And it's the sleeper who then awakens, right, to use the term from George Herbert's Dune, describing Paul Muad'Dib, right, the great leader who's prophesied in his fictional novels. So the same here with with Connors. Connors, the recurring scene of him waking out of sleep is symbolic of what's really happening to him, right? The sleep, the death that he's in is not a literal physical death. It's a mental and a spiritual death that he's stuck in. And this is why he continues to ask the question, what if there were no tomorrow? Well, we can do whatever we want, right? This is an actual quote from the screenplay. Bill, as he's drunk and bitching about this state of affairs, says something to the effect of, I'm sick of all the limits and rules they've placed on me. Right? It's almost like he's going through a teenage rebellion phase, right? When he's like 45 or something. And he says, I'm not going to worry about their rules anymore. Right? And then he sort of goes on this wild drunken binge with his buddies driving across town and gets arrested. And I think it's, as we said, it really is a kind of alchemical crisis and process that he's going through here. It's the transformation of the psyche through these different stages that is part of the journey of becoming a well-established and flourishing human being, to use the Aristotelian terminology, to grow into our telos, or our purpose. Now, yeah, then the exact quote was that I'm not living by their rules anymore. I'm not doing it by the book. I've done it all by the book. He's done it all by the book all of his life, right? He's lived according to the set program of what you're so-called supposed to do, right? To be successful, to climb the corporate ladder, to get all your funny paper money, your cash green pesto, and then get the big house and your trophy wife and all the stuff that Connors is learning through his sort of traumatic. It's almost like it's like if he went to Punxsutawney and, had like an extra massive dose of LSD. It's the best way I could describe this. And it's his like mega massive bad trip that begins to traumatically break his psyche, and then it begins to be pieced back together. We're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and we're deconstructing Groundhog Day and the Truman Show. My name is Jay Dyer, and I run jaysanalysis.com. Check it out sometime. You ought to. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. We're talking about we're going to do the Truman Show, but we're doing Groundhog Day presently. And we were looking at the psychotic break that happens with Phil Connors as he begins to discover that the problems are in his own psyche and heart, not out there in the external world, and that it's he who needs to reorder his belief system, his worldview, and his desires. Stuck in the rut of materialism and nihilism, right, following his complete egocentrism, he begins to discover that there could be more to life than climbing the corporate ladder. After his experiences in jail and with various trickery, he decides to just party and live it up, right? So then he becomes, moving out of his nihilism stage and materialism, he turns to hedonism. And so we see him trying to get laid. We see him going for all the physical pleasures. He buys a Rolls Royce after he figures out how to steal money from the bank. And he gets this, what looks to be a Playboy bunny type girl. And he's dressed like Clint Eastwood, right, in a spaghetti western, Good, Bad, and Ugly. And so he lives out all his fantasies, again, just the ultimate pursuit of bodily pleasure and kind of a Hollywood glamour lifestyle. And, he still wakes up again the next day unfulfilled and unsatisfied. And so he's starting to learn that really what he's seeking, this void that's in his soul, his heart, is more than anything material can satisfy. Right? As we have seen many times in Jay's analysis, what is it profit a man if he gain his whole world and lose his soul? And so, as we said, so that reading it from an existentialist perspective, this crisis is leading him to break from his bad faith and to begin to become authentic, right? Not because he's living this Hollywood lifestyle or his fantasy wealth, sexual dalliances, but rather because he's starting to look for meaning. Right? He's looking for more than just gaining the things that he was seeking through getting to the top of the corporate ladder. right? Because presumably getting to the top of the corporate ladder would have led to the wealth and the women. And so he decides he wants Andie MacDowell, right? The producer of the weather segment and the news segment that is not going too well because they can't seem to film it right, because Phil keeps having these sort of breakdowns and crazy sessions and spells and meltdowns, right? And so he decides what he wants to do is figure out everything he can about Andie MacDowell and seduce her. And then by seducing her, he'll be happy, right? But what he discovers is that it's all still him lying to himself, right? He's still tricking himself, and he's still trying to fix himself with some sort of external stimuli or means. And so the problem is that he only loves himself, right? He's like Narcissus. He's stuck staring in the mirror, right? What I call in my piece, the mystery of the serpentine mirror, right? The trap of egocentrism. And so as he learns everything he can about her, and then tries to seduce her and get her into the bedroom and sleep with her and get her to fall in love with him, she realizes still that it's inauthentic, right? So she slaps him and says, "How dare you? You know, you're just trying to sweet talk me, and you only love yourself." And so he's beginning to have this self-realization, and as Carl Jung would say, enter into the process of self-individuation. So what he does is he decides that he's going to focus his interests elsewhere. And so he begins to take the time that he has in this perpetually eternal recurring state to learn things and to figure out the world, and to he starts to learn classical piano. He begins to read. He begins to learn how to ice sculpt, right? And the ice sculpting scene is interesting because even when he can't seduce Andie MacDowell, he looks at the ice sculptures across town, and they are of Phil, the groundhog, and they're frozen. They're ice, right? And again, Phil is him. He is Phil, right? The groundhog and he are the same. And just as Phil is frozen in these crystalline like ice structures or statues, it's Phil Connor who is frozen, right? He's frozen in inauthenticity, in materialism, in his being in itself. Clocks are also frequently seen in this film, and that's because he's under the domination of time, of Saturn, of Kronos. And being so determined, his desire is to break free from this. The problem, of course, being that every attempt to break free from this predetermination of Kronos is such that he's only stuck running around in a circle. And just like the hands of the clock run around in circles, so is Phil Connors trapped in his own cyclical mental prison. Now, he discovers finally, after much struggle, that he's just an asshole. And that's what he tells Andie MacDowell finally, okay, I'm an asshole. Right? So he kind of comes to this moment of self-realization, and I guess almost you could say repentance, right? And the groundhog, right, keeps seeing that shadow. This is a quote: "The groundhog keeps seeing his shadow, and winter is never going to end." The shadow is Phil's false reflection of himself, right? And it's never going to go away or end because he's stuck in himself. The shadow is him. Well, then what? Well, he tries suicide. He decides he's done, right? And he drives off the cliff with Punxsutawney Phil, which is emblematic, trying to show you that they're both the same, right? They're connected. And so what happens after several suicide attempts is that his old self dies, right? Generally by falling, which is interesting. He does try to electrocute himself, but he jumps off the clock tower. He drives the truck off of the quarry pit cliff, right? And he says, finally, when he's talking to Andie MacDowell at breakfast the next morning, "I have realized, baby, I'm a god. I'm immortal." And, she says, well, I went to Catholic school and I had 12 years of theology. You're not immortal, I can tell you that. You're not a god. And then Bill Murray launches into a fascinating series of questions where he says, well, maybe the real God uses tricks, right? And so he uses a bunch of tricks to convince Andy McDowell that he has supernatural powers. Of course, he doesn't, but he's beginning to reflect on theology and philosophy and how the world really works. And he starts asking these really deep questions, right? And he says, he almost begins to take this view like, well, maybe God is a trickster God, and the world that we live in is just this sort of prison, right? And so he convinces Andy McDowell, come along with me and watch and see what happens. She says, oh, this sounds like a science project, right? So he's progressing into these different stages of knowledge almost, right? Kind of almost mirroring the stages of man or of the growth of an individual. And so as he's playing around, she asks the question, is this what you do with eternity? And he kind of stops, sits there to think about it, and he says, well, I didn't have much else to do. Right? So hard to say exactly whether this is kind of laughing at the notion of God and immortality or posing it as a real question that we could consider. I think, maybe you could take it either way. I guess it would partly depend, on the writers and Harold Ramis's view, which I don't know what his theological views were, but he also says in this same scene, in an interesting quote, he says, I've killed myself so many times that I don't exist anymore. So it's almost back to that Platonic notion, right, of non-being. It's almost like he's falling away into non-being, and he doesn't even know what is real and not real anymore, right? He says, I don't exist anymore. And so he's really beginning to ask these important questions of life and philosophy and things that accompany, right, what we might call an awakening, so to speak, right? The beginning of the realization of asking questions outside of merely what you've been raised or programmed to believe. And so later on, he says, right, his dialogue is sprinkled throughout with these kinds of phrases and quotes, and as he's learning and becoming educated, he begins to say things like, only God can make a tree, right? When he's reading Andy McDowell poetry. Interesting quote, right? Because this fits into this dialectic of nature and man, right? Man as a free individual, a being possessing will and volition, as opposed to nature being determined and lacking in free will, right? Animals don't have free will, humans do. And so it's almost as if we, along with Bill Murray, are the questions that we're talking about here philosophically in this talk. It's almost like these are the questions that Bill Murray in his experience is beginning to realize, is beginning to learn and understand that there's more to existence than my own ego, and to the world than my own. I'm not the center of the world, even though I feel like I'm at the center of the world and everything's revolving around me here in Punxsutawney, because I'm stuck here. This is exactly what Truman will ask too, by the way. He's beginning to look outside of himself. And so the suicide scenes, I think, are intended to convey this death of the old self, right? He's dying to death. He's dying to that state of being into materialistic, egoistic nihilism. And he's beginning to awaken to reality and to other aspects to the human being, such as love. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and we're breaking down Groundhog Day. And when we come back, we'll finish with this and get into the topic of the Truman Show. As we close then with the subject of Groundhog Day, it's interesting to note, the Samuel Taylor Coleridge quote that's given in the hallway to the chubby guy and the Anton Chekhov quote about bleak winter, because the notion here is, again, that when people are happy, according to Chekhov, they don't notice the seasons, right? This is a quote attributed to him, at least. And that is applicable, I think, to Phil Connors, right? Because he's beginning to experience a real change. And so as he's becoming the good guy, he's no longer Scrooge. He goes out and, tries to basically fix the world. He tries to save everybody. He tries to fix and save everything. Rescue the old homeless man who dies and the kid who falls from the tree. And he learns ultimately that, you can't right all the wrongs. You're still, even though he's had a change of heart and he's becoming a good guy, he's still not figuring out that he has limitations, right? And he's still somewhat naive. And it takes time, right, for him to realize that his focus needs to be accurately and properly placed on things outside of himself, higher ideals, right? The good, the just, right? If we were to use Platonic terminology. And I would say, of course, ultimately God or theology. And that's the best way and the only way, ultimately, that he can be healed and changed for the better. And so trying to be Superman, trying to do it on your own and so forth, these things are not ultimately humanly possible. Man needs, I would say, alteration that can only come from outside of himself. And so to become his fullest self, right, it takes him, a long time, right, through going through he's basically being put through the same situations to learn his lesson, right? And he decides, ultimately in the end that he's going to move to the country with Andie MacDowell and that they're going to be happy, because that ultimately was what he needed to begin with, right? He didn't need all of the things that he thought were going to fulfill and satisfy and fix him, right? All these material things, all of this hedonism, that was ultimately just adding to the problem, right? And leading towards self-destruction and suicide. What he needed was to alter and fix his heart and his focus and attention, and to remember and look at and think about and live according to the higher ideals, and then the other things would fall into place, right? That's the only point at which he finally is successful with Andie MacDowell, and then he finds solace and happiness in a new lifestyle, right, outside of the hustle and bustle of the urban city environment, which ultimately leads to what Durkheim called anomie, right? That alienation of the city. And that concludes Groundhog Day. Certainly much more could be said, but I can't do everything about Groundhog Day. So we got to move on to something equally interesting and important, a little more esoteric and conspiratorial, and that would be the 1998 film Truman Show, right? Now, I'm sure most people have seen the Truman Show, so I don't need to summarize the basic plot of this film. It's very, very well known. But there's a lot of interesting symbolism in the film that's not well known, that a lot of people miss over. And, I've not really seen a lot of really good dissections of this film online. I've seen a few. But from the outset, what we see is a bunch of interviews, and they're interviews of people who are actors in this show called The Truman Show. And we find out that Truman Burbank is this guy who has lived basically his entire existence inside a controlled environment, just like Punxsutawney was in Groundhog Day. Here, however, it's a controlled environment of a completely crafted, vast TV set, right? Inside of a giant dome, right? And this is Truman's whole world. Truman has been intentionally caged in and kept in this small world so that he can never, ever leave. And there's fascinating insights into how this is all done, right, that I think are going to be parallel to the real world and how the real world is constructed and how it keeps people trapped in their own little boxes, and we don't actually learn reality. We don't learn the truth. We stay trapped in a box. Again, perfect analogy, the allegory of the cave from Plato's Republic, Book 7. Now, as Truman walks out of his porch onto to meet the day for, I guess, the beginning of the work week, we notice that he lives in the home address of 36. And 36 is important because, well, it's 3 6s, right? Which adds up to 18. And then 1 and 8 is 9, right? Or 6 plus 3 is 9, right? Because 9 is going to pop up quite frequently in this film. 9 in many Hermetic and esoteric traditions is the number of initiation. And that's going to be important because it's Truman who, in a sense, I'm not trying to overplay the initiation aspect of it, which I do think was going on in Eyes Wide Shut, but here the initiation is not into some cult or secret society. It's an initiation, a ritual process, an undergoing of awakening to the real world, right? And the lies that have encapsulated Truman Burbank. So as he walks out, he sees this sort of plasticine suburban neighborhood in which he lives with his wife, played by Laura Linney. And we, from the vantage point of the viewer, are looking in on this meta-narrative structure of a TV show within a TV show, movie within a movie. And we're seeing surveillance cameras everywhere, right? So there's surveillance cameras all over the city, all over, everywhere in his house, in his car, and everything he does is not just tracked and traced, but also broadcast to the rest of the real world. Now, this panopticism theme, right, as we've said many times on the show, goes back to 18th century British and French philosophy, such as Jeremy Bentham, right, where the idea was to construct a prison. It was originally a prison architectural philosophy where you could put a guard tower in the center, which at all times could look in on a surrounding octagonal prison cell structure with all the cells being open-faced, right? So the central guard tower could always look in upon the prisoners. You had no privacy ever. And what this did was, over time, it altered human patterns of behavior. The cellmates would police themselves, right? And this ultimately is what the purpose of mass surveillance is. Obviously, the NSA or the CIA or whoever does not have the capability to perpetually surveil every single person at all times. They might like to have that, but that is, at least at this point, not really feasible, right? So what has to happen is the construction of a massive AI grid, smart cities and so forth, to where that can actually be accomplished, right? And so the goal of the smart cities will be really to create a Truman Show type world, or at least for the major cities in which the population will live in cube-like Agenda 21 housing, right, inside of a giant Walmart or something. Now, so this leave it to beaver imagery, right, I think is kind of supposed to signify this facade of the, middle-class American suburban household and the ideology and belief structure that most of the people in that socioeconomic sphere would have. It's showing that it's all really just nonsense and created, right? And as Truman walks out of the front door, we see this light fall from the heavens, right? A huge stage light falls down and lands in the lands in the road. And importantly, when he picks it up, we notice that it reads Sirius, Canis Major. Now, why would the light have Sirius written on it? And why would it say Canis Major? Well, to Freemasonry, Sirius, the dog star, plays an important role as ultimately, in a way, signifying, I think, kind of a dark force from which we would say we're under the domination of what St. Paul in Ephesians calls principalities, powers, and dark forces, right? Now, to the Masonic mind, it means rather the control structures of humanity, right? Or the structures that are built in which to control humanity. And so, because I think Masonry is ultimately about the philosophy of ruling men, and the different trickeries, deceits, and hoodwinks that are used to control men, it's really only those that are hip to the game that understand it. And that's why the light has not just Sirius written on it, right? The Dog Star constellation, but it also has the number 9 written on it. It's exactly what I was telling you before, the number of awakening, initiation, and so forth. Right, 9 is for Truman going to pop up consistently throughout the film. We're told, in fact, that the beginning of the film is day 10,909, right? 2 more 9s. And curious dating, right? 10,909. Why isn't it put in years? Well, that's kind of the style of Masonic dating. If you've seen how Masonry dates things, or they'll date things according to the history of the Earth, and it's, year 5,600 and whatever, right? Masonic dating systems, right? Now, as Truman begins to start his day and he's heading towards work, there's a couple curious things to point out that are also, I think, crucial signifiers of what's going on in the film. And one of those will, of course, be product placement, but I'll save that when we come back from the break. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and I'm your host, Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to my philosophy lectures over at jaysanalysis.com at the PayPal link. Stay tuned as we get. Welcome back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. We're breaking down the Truman Show and showing all the really deep symbolism and Masonic imagery, I think, that is encapsulated throughout this film. And then it's ultimately going to be a pretty philosophical revelation of what's going on in the real world, that we actually live in a prison planet of sorts, right? And we begin to see this when Truman heads to work, and he picks up a newspaper, and as he picks up the newspaper, he's holding it, and what we see is under his arm, and all we can see is the word Earth. And I think this is kind of a clue letting us know that, it's not really just an enclosed environment that the film is intending to convey, but rather that the Earth itself works this way, right? The Earth is under this kind of control structure, right? Where we're told a bunch of different things at different levels of society, right? And so Truman exemplifies this middle class, right, American, almost 50s-ish era type of worldview, right, where he's under the impression that all that there is his own little town and his suburban lifestyle and his boring office job. And so Truman, as we saw, begins to question things when he sees the light fall from the sky that, of course, reads Sirius. And as he's walking to work, there's a couple of weird events where a guy pushes him up against a poster of Kaiser Chicken. And, of course, we in the audience know that this is product placement. So it's almost like the entire society is participating in product placement, right? Even in this, what will be a reality show. Now, this came out in 1998, right? Kind of at the heyday of when reality shows were really taking off in the mid to late 90s through MTV. And we know that ultimately that was all a CIA plot to condition people to getting used to mass surveillance and the idea of being your own little star. And then, of course, that would transition into the internet and social media, where you could create your own little following and fanfare and be a star of your own world. And as Truman begins to suspect things are a little weird, we learn that he wants to go to Fiji, right? He has this, he's got postcards and plans that he's wanted to visit Fiji just because he's never been. And it goes back to his high school crush with a girl that he really liked all along, who he did not end up with, right? and because she was studying Japanese and talking about Fiji. So it's kind of been implanted in his subconscious since puberty that he wants to go to Fiji, right? Now, as he's going to work, again, we start to notice things like crisis actors, I guess is the best way to put it, that the people are acting very strange around him. It's almost like he's being gang stalked. And as things at times get a little out of whack, we notice that even the radio news stories that Truman hears are crafted, right? They're crafted to explain the events that don't match up to his own perception and logic. So when he starts to question the light, or question things at work, or question people following him, things like that, he hears radio stories that give him the interpretation of events that the system wants him to have, right? And if you heard my Esoteric Hollywood interview with Chris Kindle of hoaxbusterscall.com, that was a great point that he made, that the news kind of gives these sound bites about so-called events like terror events, mass shootings, and then the rest of the story is then filled in through the fiction. And so what we start to see with Truman is that as he's going about his daily business, there's subliminal things that are placed all around him to condition him, right, into not leaving his hometown. He sees newspapers that say things like, New Haven, I think is the name of the city, or Haven Falls, whatever it is the greatest place to live. Why would you ever want to leave? He sees a newspaper that says, who needs Europe, right? Who needs to travel? And then when he goes to the travel agency, there's posters everywhere on the wall about how you shouldn't travel. Right? There's a big 747 being struck by lightning, right? And then there's a list of planning on traveling, and then it says, beware of terrorism, of planes crashing and so forth, right? And so what we start to see is that the entire environment around him can be controlled and crafted. And that's because it's run from a top-down pyramid structure, with Ed Harris, of course, sitting at the top of the pyramid, in the eye of the pyramid, in a kind of overtly Masonic sense, right? Now, obviously, Ed Harris is not literally inside a pyramid, although he will be at the top of a flight of stairs, which will also, interestingly, be Masonic. Now, Freeman wears an obsidian ring, which I think is curious, because seems to be a similar obsidian necklace that his wife wears. And I'm not sure what to make of the ring and the necklace, except that perhaps this obsidian, right, this is sort of the black stone, right, of the meteor from space, or the black obelisk of 2001. I don't know what the significance of the jewelry is, except that perhaps we're supposed to think Truman himself is maybe in a Masonic lodge, right? I mean, this would make sense for being a middle-class male, right, in this completely controlled environment. So maybe he's a lower-level Mason, and as he progresses in his knowledge, he's going to understand that, right, it's Ed Harris who's at the top of the pyramid, right? So the deeper, darker secrets, right, of what Sirius really is. The dog star. And there are other interesting astrological parallels that come up as well, and astrology has an important place in Masonic philosophy too, where when Truman sees the light fall and it says Canis Major, right, the dog star, he then talks about Pluto, the dog, right? Pluto comes up to him, right? Which is supposed to be a planet, we're told, although that has been downgraded, I guess, is no longer a planet according to science. Science can't even tell it what the planets are. But and then we move to the twins, right? He sees these two weird twins walking around, right? And the twins are, of course, Gemini. So I think there's definite astrological and stellar symbolism throughout the film, and not just the very overt sun and moon, I guess we could call them holograms, right? Because they're projected on the screen of the dome inside the Truman Show. And I think that if we wanted to try to understand that, then we could make sense of it as being bound by time and space and being under the domination of the elements, right? To use, again, the Pauline terminology from, say, Colossians 1 and 2, or the philosophy of, say, the Eastern Church Fathers, who talk about how man is dominated by the elements until he is converted and understands the freedom that comes through the Logos. That would be Christ. Now, it's funny, too, that we see throughout the film the things that Laura Linney's doing as his wife is also intended to subliminally program Freeman. So we see her initially reading a book, a children's book, because they want to have kids, and the book that she's reading is Dreamtime. And this, I think, is supposed to keep Truman in a subliminal dream state, right? She's constantly doing this. She's constantly advertising things, as well as everyone else around Truman. Now, excuse me, how is it ultimately that Truman is kept in this small town? Well, it's through fear. So the controllers know the phobia, the fear that Truman has, and his fear is precisely water and leaving via water. So initially, when he tries to book a plane flight, he discovers that all the flights are booked. He then tries to take a bus out of town, and the bus breaks down, and he starts to figure out that he's not getting out of there, right? He's stuck. And that the only way out is if he's willing to get in a boat and sail his way out of there. But of course, sailing goes back to his programming that he received as a child through the phobia of losing his father in a shipwreck, right? They were out sailing, and his father, he believed, drowned, and so he is for then on scarred and has, of course, the phobia of never sailing again, and he can't get anywhere near the water. So his friend is interesting, his buddy, who's also, of course, part of the act, who's always trying to talk him into staying there, not leaving, not going anywhere. And he's always bringing a six-pack over, right? He always shows up with the six-pack and then advertises it for the cameras, right? It's more product placement. But as they're discussing together the hopes and dreams, Truman's bugged because his friend doesn't have any hopes and dreams, right? His friend just wants to be the snack machine serviceman, right? Who comes and fills all the snack machines and doesn't care about going anywhere, or traveling, or seeing anything. And so Truman says, "Don't you ever want to go to Fiji?" And his buddy says, "What the hell's Fiji? Where's that?" Like, I don't know what idiot doesn't know where. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. We're breaking down the Truman Show, and we've gotten to the point where Truman is starting to question his reality, right? Just like Phil Connors was in Groundhog Day, and he's starting to realize that maybe there's a whole world out there, and maybe I'm actually stuck in some kind of matrix. What the hell's going on? And so they go in there. He has these scenes, of course, where he's pondering, and he's alone. He's sitting under the moon, and he's really starting to question whether or not he's a prisoner. Is he in a prison planet? And I think the moon is interesting because the moon always signifies the feminine. It always signifies nature. It always signifies also kind of insanity, which is where we get the term lunacy, right? It regulates the tides, we're told, and it regulates in some way, or is connected to the female menstrual cycle, right? So Diana, of course, the goddess, is also symbolized by the moon. And I think, again, that the impression that we're supposed to have is that Truman is completely controlled. He's determined. He's like an animal. He's like Pluto. He's like a dog, right? He's a trained dog, and he's unable to think his way or question or get out of the control structure that he's been placed in, almost in a kind of mass psyop experiment. And as I mentioned before, the excellent 1967 British series The Prisoner, it's the exact same scenario there, where number 6, right, Patrick McGowan's character wakes up in a completely controlled environment where everything is surveilled. Everyone around him is a kind of actor. It's all fake. And he doesn't know how he got there, and he doesn't know how to get out. And the whole show, the premise over 17 episodes, is just him trying to outwit the controllers and get away, to get out of the nightmare of prison that, and I won't ruin The Prisoner for you if you've never seen it. Well, I'll leave it at that. But with Truman, it's the exact same situation, right? He's under the dominance of external forces that are outside of his control. And he's had this childhood desire to explore, to see the world. He's wanted to go out and see what's out there. However, he's of course been programmed and conditioned to believe, like a Pavlovian dog, that there is nothing else but your small town. Why would you want to go anywhere? Why would you want to see anything? All there is what's there beside you and in front of you. Now, there's a curious scene where his dad sneaks in, right? And his dad shows up pretending to be a kind of bum, right? And he bumps into Truman secretly and tries to say, hey, I'm not dead. It's all a lie. And Truman freaks out, right? And he's like, what the heck's going on? All right. This is where he really begins to question things, right? He starts to notice that, I'm being lied to. Something else is going on here. And so then right after that scene where there's this whole directed crisis actor type scenario, we see Truman standing under 2 pillars that above the pillars have the writing, all for one and one for all, in Latin. Right? Now this is this kind of collectivist sort of control structure, right, that Masonry has for a long time promoted communism and collectivism as a way to make sure that humans are corralled and herded into groupthink, and that they don't think on their own outside of mass consensus, right? So what we call consensus reality, the idea that everybody has to think the same, and if you dare to think outside that box, you could be dangerous, you could be a threat, you could be a challenge to the control structure, and therefore, you need to be shamed or, called crazy or whatever. And this is what happens with Truman. He starts to doubt the Masonic control structure around him, and everybody begins to freak out, right? And they don't leave out any possible measure, right, by which to try to coax him into staying in his little box, right? And it's interesting that in the basement, it's in the basement where he's stored this chest of all his secret desires. And so in the chest he has pictures of the girlfriend that he always wished he had. In the chest there's the things back from elements from his childhood, nostalgia of wanting to be an explorer, and then of course being convinced that there's no such thing as explorers. You don't need to go anywhere. You have a house payment, right? All this kind of stuff. And continually too, throughout the show, we're shown the people who are watching the Truman Show, and their reactions are of course global, right? Because the panopticism is global, right? So we're supposed to continually understand that the Truman Show is not about a fictional created, CIA, UN community somewhere. The Truman Show is the world, right? And the world is intended to be engineered and moved into this completely panoptic state where the AI control grid will, as I said, throughout the smart cities and so forth, have perpetual and total surveillance and tracking. Now, Truman has been cutting out images from from magazines, I should say, from women's magazines, because he's trying to find the eyes of the girl that he originally had the crush on in high school, Lauren. And it's interesting that he would be fascinated with her eyes, because eyes are, of course, windows to the soul. Eyes are another term for spies or spooks. Eyes, of course, signify surveillance, and they also signify the top of the pyramid, right? The all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid. And in this film, the all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid is, as we said, Ed Harris, who is sort of the master mason, I guess you could say, who is running the show, so to speak, and then broadcasting it out to the rest of the world, which is, we figure out, the most popular show in history, right? The Truman Show becomes the ultimate TV show because it's a reality show. And it's a mix of Truman, who is not in on the trick, on the hoodwink, with everyone else in his environment being in on it, right? So it's a mix of fiction and reality blended into a seamless television series, The Truman Show, that's lasted Truman's whole life. And the joke, of course, is kind of, Truman figuring this out, and that will, of course, be the climax of the series when Truman does finally discover what's going on through a series of errors. There's a radio error. It's tracking him, right? He realizes that he's being gang stalked, and this sort of that they've even staged his past, right? He figures out, or he notices that Laura Linney is crossing her fingers in the marriage photo, right? So she doesn't really love him. His wife's fake. The family's fake. And everything that's being broadcast at him during his life is something to condition him. And he finally notices this and breaks free from it, right? And so what does he do? Well, he realizes he's got to overcome his phobia, and so he finally decides that he's going to just sail out of his small town. And as he sails away, he's almost going to drown. They pull out all the stops, trying to trip him up. And he finally gets to the edge of the universe, so to speak, his universe, and it's a huge dome, right? He's in a big Stephen King biodome type scenario. I think a Brendan Fraser movie with Biodome or something with Pauly Shore. And at the edge of this enclosed structure is, a completely fictional sky. We learn that the sun and the moon are fake, and there's a stairway. And this is almost, I think, reminiscent of a kind of Masonic stairway that you'll see in a lot of Masonic posters and images and prints. You'll see this ladder, the stairway that you're supposed to ascend up to, the truth of enlightenment, the light of Lucifer and reason and so forth, and the star at the top, the starry heavens up at the top. And this is, I think, probably one of the clearest Masonic images in the film when he gets to the top of the staircase, and Ed Harris's voice comes out from behind the clouds and says, Truman, you got a big decision to make here. Do you want to walk out, or do you want to stay where you are? We all love you. Please stay where you are. And Truman kind of flips him the bird and then walks off into the darkness, right? Whatever's out there. And what does that mean? Well, I think it's kind of ultimately to perpetuate the sort of Masonic Gnostic myth, right? The Masonic Gnostic myth is that the God that created this world is some kind of evil God, and he's a trickster God. And the truth is that ultimately all religions are fake, they're lies, and we live in a kind of control structure, and that the true art, so to speak, the art of arts, is the art of governing man. And how is man governed? Well, he's governed through psychology, through scientific technique, and through operant conditioning and programming, and through mystifying him, so to speak, right? And it's only those who and I'm giving the explanation according to the Masonic mythology, right? It's only those who ascend the ladder to figure this out, that it's kind of a big game, it's a big hoodwink, right? That's kind of the ultimate secret, is that it's a big hoodwink, right? And that once you learn the tricks of hoodwinkery, scamming, and con artistry, then you're fit for the royal art of ruling man. Interesting too, other parallels to other films that we'll talk about, but I think that's the crux of the matter with the Truman Show, and many interesting parallels as we saw, preparing for things like reality TV to come and surveillance. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. You're listening to my breakdown of Groundhog Day and the Truman Show, and we're just closing up with the Truman Show here, where Truman walks out into the darkness, after kind of giving Ed Harris the bird. And notice that, Ed Harris is wearing the beret too, which the beret is kind of as I understand, French salon type accoutrement, and the French salon, right, would be the wellspring from which the French Revolution would find its foothold in the history of France, and then as the 1789 revolution would spread globally, right, as well as the 1776 revolution. Those revolutions are connected. And we still live then under that Masonic rule, right? So whether it's the Statue of Liberty or the Eiffel Tower, both of which are Masonic symbols, this is the governing philosophy and control structure of the modern world, particularly since the Enlightenment. That's the modus operandi of global government. And as we said, the philosophy there ultimately has a lot to do with stellar symbolism, astrology, right? And on this darker note, I think, ultimately has to do with invoking the different spiritual powers associated with those different Ariel houses, so to speak, right? Houses of the zodiac, we might think, right? And the different gods of those regions and realms. And those gods have a significance and a relevance to various locales, places, and times on the earth. And if you believe the biblical story, then you believe that this is due to the fall, right? There was a fall that affected not just earth, but also the stellar heavens as well. And the angels that rebelled are the spiritual forces that rule from on high in rebellion against God, right? Ultimately, God, of course, has control. But there is a time period in which we live underneath the rebellion of the fallen spiritual forces, right? Masonic mythology, of course, is different, where it borrows some of these symbols and imagery and sort of blends it into this idea that we live in a Gnostic material realm, which needs to be escaped from through some sort of perhaps technological means, right? So the ultimate secrets of masonry and so forth are materialism and scientism, right? And the art of ruling men through subterfuge, trickery, and psychological techniques and scams. Operant conditioning, Pavlov, right? That's the ultimate deep secrets there. And the Luciferianism, so called, at least for those who don't believe in spiritual forces, signifies the guidance and worship of reason. Reason is what guides science and scientific technique and process, and reason is what supposedly guides the technocratic socialist state, right? And that's ultimately the goal of the Masonic philosophy, is the world socialist state. And we know that from someone like H.G. Wells, who explained and said all that quite openly in his books. And, a couple other films come to mind that came out in the 90s around this time. There was Dark City, which is Alex Proyas's interesting film, which has the same Gnostic themes that I've mentioned before. Curiously as well there, Rufus Sewell's character wants to escape to Shell Beach. And the idea is, I just need to get away, and if I can get to Shell Beach, this postcard I've got that reminds me of something I saw as a kid. There's a beach somewhere with shells. That's where I was happy. If I can get back to that, I'll find happiness. However, Dark City is ruled by a bunch of dark archons and demonic forces who, within a completely controlled environment, right, keep him trapped. And so Rufus Sewell, of course, has to learn these sort of preternatural magic powers, I guess, to outwit and outsmart the Archons, who are kind of robotic controlled creatures without any kind of creativity, and thereby Rufus Sewell kind of achieves apotheosis and can create his own Shell Beach. Very similar to what we see here in the Truman Show, where Truman was longing for the beach, longing for Fiji, right, to get away to some tropical island locale. Another film, too, from the same time period that has this theme, as well as The Matrix, quite obviously, is a film called The 13th Floor. And I'm speaking off the top of my head here, so I can't recall who directed The 13th Floor, but in that film, it's very similar to The Matrix, where you have the idea of creating a virtual world, a completely controlled environment, and it's very much a prison, and the only way to escape from it, right, is to sort of discover the secrets of the systemic programming and who the great architect of the program was, or the great architect of the universe that we think about from Masonic mythology, who is for them this kind of demiurge character. This great architect is explicitly mentioned in The Matrix, right? The Matrix talks about the architect, right, who is the controller of the Matrix, and he is himself a kind of program, right? A controlled robotic program. And in the same way, it's very fascinating. Probably due to the rise of the internet, and the computer technology that was advancing so fast, right, in the 90s, the dot-com bubble and all this stuff, and we began to see the expansion and installment of the internet. That's probably partly why you saw all these internet-based movies, in the 90s, and films like Johnny Mnemonic or Lawnmower Man, or with this theme of virtual worlds and virtual realms and being trapped inside of them, and well, what if our world is actually a virtual world? And interestingly, this thought actually goes all the way back to, well, you could ultimately go back to, I guess, the Gnostics or ancient philosophy, but in more recent times back to Descartes, who in the Meditations, of course, considered the possibility that, how do I know that I'm not presently in a dream state, and maybe my brain's in a vat somewhere and there's an evil demon who's in control of everything, right? Well, Descartes not new to that idea. Descartes borrowing from the notion of Gnosticism, that the creator of this world is a demiurge, an archon, an evil being who put us here in a kind of prison to torture us. Gnostic and, of course, occultic perspectives reverse all of that and kind of muddle it, right? And they say that, the creator of this world is an evil entity, the evil god, and the good god's, way beyond this realm, and you got to kind of escape out of this realm through the planetary spheres or something to get back to, the blessed realm of the good, the beyond, whatever, nirvana. And interesting, all of these, philosophical notions are blending very profoundly into, all these 90s films that deal with the internet and, constructed Matrix-like virtual worlds. Now, of course, all of those films will be dealt with on their own. I think they deserve their own extensive analyses, especially films like Dark City or The Matrix. And so those will be coming in the future at Esoteric Hollywood, but they bear mentioning because of the preponderance, right, of these kinds of movies, particularly in the 90s, right? And As I said, my thesis would be that it would be related to, the rise of the internet, and especially with the Truman Show, the rise of the surveillance state, right? And that we were being prepped and conditioned for perpetual surveillance and cameras everywhere, precisely because 9/11 was coming. And we know from documents like the PNAC or from Zbigniew Brzezinski's 90s book, The Grand Chessboard, where he talked about the big catalyzing event that needed to happen, as well as all the neocons in their PNAC document, and as well as all the many fictional references to 9/11, particularly even in The Matrix, right? The Matrix uses the numerology of 9/11 on 9/11 2001, by the way, on Neo's passport, I believe, right? It's his passport. When Agent Smith is interrogating him, we can see the clear image of 9/11 2001. And of course, that film was supposed to be far in the future, and was made, I believe, in 1998, right? Or 97 or 98 is when the first Matrix came out, still yet prior to the events of 2001. And we saw in previous conversations about 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? Why did Kubrick choose 2001? A big black monolith, right? Interesting parallels there and possibilities for pre-signifiers and predictive programming in relationship to the events of 9/11. And if you've ever read Jay's analysis, or you're aware of any of my talks, you'll know that I do quite constantly point out these kinds of things, these predictive programming elements that we see, especially in relationship to 9/11, which I think was a mega mass ritual and psyop. And to use 9/11 as an example, it's kind of like the Truman Show, right? Where we have this event that we're told is one thing, and we're told how it went down and who did it a certain way, and everyone believes it, right? Just like Truman in the Truman Show believed that his previous mundane existence, right, was as he thought it was, right? He believed according to everything he was programmed and told. And just like Phil Connors, Bill Murray's character in Groundhog Day, believed everything that he was told, right, according to his sophisticated city slicker lifestyle. And only after a severe traumatic break did he come to realize that he had believed in a massive lie. And in the same way, Truman believed in a massive lie most of his life. And upon discovering it, he exits the Matrix. In the same way, I would exhort you, my listeners out there, to don't listen to the lies that you're told through the mainstream media and to exit the Matrix. You're listening to Jay's analysis, and this is you're listening to my analysis, right, of The Truman Show on Esoteric Hollywood on TalkNetwork.com. Check out jaysanalysis.com and check out j.talknetwork.com.